All right, council member, you're good to go.
All right, I'll start my mental countdown in my mind. Good afternoon. My name is Treyon White. I serve as a council member of Ward 8, but also the chair of committee of Recreation, Libraries, and Youth Affairs. Today is Thursday, October the 20th, 2022. We are meeting remotely using the Zoom platform. The time is now 12:04 p.m. and I'm calling to order this public hearing of the committee. Today we're reviewing Bill B24-0946, eliminating restrictive and segregated enclosures. This bill was introduced by Councilmember Che, Nadeau, Silverman, McDuffie, Lewis George, and Robert White. This bill prohibits nearly in all forms of segregated confinement for individuals incarcerated at penal institutions owned, operated, controlled by Department of Corrections and Department of Youth Rehabilitation Services to include limiting the use of safe cells, and in certain circumstances requires that people with mental health emergencies be treated at local hospitals and institutions if they cannot receive the care they need at a secure setting. Furthermore, the bill requires the Department of Corrections and DYRS to create a plan to eliminate segregated confinement and to report to the council the effects of this legislation. This bill was consequently referred to the Committee on Recreation, Library, and Youth Affairs, and to the Committee on Judiciary and Public Affairs and Public Safety. I'm sorry. The hearing today will only focus on the aspect that the bill will fall under our committee, which is DYRS, Department of Youth Rehabilitation Services. The committee is interested in comparing the current practices policies to include how the Comprehensive Youth Justice Amendment Act of 2016 is being implemented by DYRS and how Bill 24-0946 eliminating restrictive and segregated enclosures would affect DYRS. We are joined today by Councilmembers Murray Che, who introduced the bill, along with Councilmember Pinto. You all have an opening statement. I'll start with you, Councilmember Chase, since I saw you first, and then we'll see.
Yes, thank you, Chairperson White. I was proud to introduce this bill with Council members Nadeau, Silverman, McDuffie, Lewis George, and Robert White. Segregated confinement, often referred to as solitary confinement, is the cruel, inhumane, and degrading mode of punishment in which an incarcerated person lives in a small cell with little or no meaningful contact with other people. Studies have shown that solitary confinement can create or exacerbate short and long-term psychological and physical health issues, including risk of self-harm, suicide, anxiety, depression, gastrointestinal and cardiovascular problems. The stress of solitary can even lead to permanent changes in a person's identity. Further, research suggests that solitary may actually lead to an increase in violence and recidivism, as it deprives incarcerated people of the opportunity to participate in genuinely rehabilitative activities like education or mental health treatment. And it's for these reasons that solitary confinement has been equated by some to actual torture. The legislation prohibits nearly all forms of solitary confinement for individuals incarcerated at penal institutions owned, operated, and controlled by the Department of Corrections or the Department of Youth Rehabilitation Services, and has further provisions that we will no doubt discuss as we proceed. But I want to add something because of this committee's attention to that portion of it dealing with young people. This bill will be especially important for children under the supervision of the Department of Youth Rehabilitation Services. The negative effects of solitary are only exacerbated when applied to a child. Children who enter the juvenile justice system in the district need to be supported so that they can become healthy and successful, and they shouldn't be subjected to further trauma at the hands of the government. Thank you very much for bringing this forward, Councilmember White.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Councilman Pinto, do you have an opening statement?
I do. I'll be brief, but thank you so much, Chairman White, for holding this hearing on this bill today. And I want to thank our colleague, Councilmember Che, for introducing this important bill. There has been a wealth of research conducted on the impacts of solitary confinement, and the results are clear. The practice is not only antithetical to our goals of rehabilitation, but it actively causes psychological and physical harm to those it impacts. People placed in solitary confinement experience higher rates of stress, depression, and suicide. In fact, studies have shown that people who experience extreme socio-environmental deprivation suffer physical changes to their brain, which can result in major psychiatric disorders and a higher risk of mortality. Prolonged isolation should not be a practice that is utilized in DC, especially when it comes to caring for our young people. Today, I want to discuss the changes that need to be made at DYRS to protect the mental health and safety of young people in their care while implementing this legislation. So thank you to all of those who are testifying and for the advocacy around this important issue. Thank you.
Thank you. We do have a number of public witnesses today that we will hear from in regards to this bill. We will start with, if we can elevate to the panel, Taylor Newville, Melissa Wasser, Tammy Seltzer, I can't see from this who is here and who is not here, so you all can give me a message in the chat and let me know. Do we have Taylor Newville? And let me know if I'm pronouncing your name right. Who's
Yes,
speaking?
Chairman White, you have me. We've met before.
Hello, how are you?
Hi, we met with Graylin
Yes,
on, yeah, so I'm here. And if you're ready for me, I'm ready to go.
yep, you're number one. Go right ahead.
Okay, so good afternoon, Chairman White and other committee members. My name is Taylor Newville, and I am the Executive Director of Who Speaks for Me. I'm here today to add my insights to the Erase Bill. And while we are focusing on youth, I'm going to speak in general about my own personal experience as an adult, because I think it lends some insight to what actually, if it's happening, if these experiences are mine as an adult, it can only be exacerbated for a youth. I want to state that Who Speaks for Me absolutely believes in that all forms of solitary confinement should be banned. However, we do not agree with the current language of the bill, specifically as it relates to safe cells, or what I know them personally as suicide watch. I want to focus my attention on safe cells, known as suicide watch. You might want to know that Who Speaks for Me was born from my last stay on suicide watch in a federal prison. I was often put on suicide watch because of my attitude, not because I was suicidal. Suicide watch is a more degrading form of solitary. You are stripped of all your clothing, including socks and underwear, and placed in a large quilted gown that fastens with Velcro. We know it as the turtle suit. You are then placed in a cell that is usually freezing cold. The lights are not turned off. There is no privacy. There is no actual mental health. My last stay on suicide watch happened in my last 3 months of incarceration, and it lasted for 3 weeks. A guard was angry with me because he intentionally destroyed my knitting, and as I sat writing him up, he reported me to the lieutenant. The next thing I know, I'm deemed suicidal. I was angry and had no desire to hurt myself. I would have liked to smack the crap out of the guard for abusing his power, but I was not suicidal. 3 weeks, they left me there, freezing, naked under a quilted gown we called the turtle suit. The mental health staff came by daily and through a steel door yelled, "Are you wanting to hurt yourself?" Near the end of the 3 weeks, I looked up at the ceiling and whispered, "Who is speaking for me?" Nobody knows what they are doing to me. When I was released from that safety cell, I was torn down and I really did want to die. I went back to my cell in the dorm and drafted a plan for an organization we now know as Who Speaks for Me. Because when we are on the inside, those on the outside need to know that they can help. Who Speaks for Me does not support the Erase Bill in its current form. The authors did not take time to interview or receive input from those of us who have survived suicide watch. There should be no situation with someone is stripped of their clothing, and placed in confinement because they seem suicidal. If someone has actively tried to harm themselves, a doctor or a mental health professional needs to be called to interview the person. If someone harms himself to the point of needing medical attention outside the jail, then the last resort should be outside patient hospitalization. However, even this practice needs a third party's input. There is much more I would like to say. However, the erase bill needs to be refined and the authors need to be inclusive of the work to bring it to a point of going up for a vote. As it stands, Who Speaks for Me does not support this erase bill in its current form. I want to also add that what Councilmember Pinto said about long forms of detainment causing mental health and other physical problems. That time while I was on suicide watch, I experienced for the first and only time in my life, kidney stones that had to be passed while I writhed around on the floor in pain and throwing up. So no one can tell me that there's a reason for suicide watch. I'll also say the bill says that if someone is suicidal, they can be taken out to an outside medical. The reason we don't support this is because someone says you're suicidal doesn't mean you should be placed in outside medical, because that could extend your time. Imagine being pre-trial and the most you could do on your time is a year, but you're taken out of the facility, placed in a mental health ward, and spend 8 months there, and none of that time counts. This could be more punitive than helpful. And for that reason, we do not support the erase bill in its current form. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. We appreciate you being vulnerable and sharing your testimony. We'll come back with some questions in a few. Ms. Taylor Newville. Melissa Watser. Yeah.
Great. Hi, Chairman White, members of the committee, good afternoon. My name is Melissa Wasser. I use she, her pronouns, and I am policy counsel at the American Civil Liberties Union of the District of Columbia, also known as ACLU-DC. ACLU-DC is committed to ending the practice of solitary confinement because it jeopardizes public safety, wastes taxpayer dollars, and is inhumane and traumatic to the individuals who endure it. Ending solitary confinement demands confronting inequities in the criminal justice system and the racial bias driving them. As mentioned in Councilmember Che and Councilmember Pinto's opening statements, people placed in solitary confinement can exhibit a variety of negative psychological reactions, including severe and chronic depression, self-mutilation, decreased brain function, hallucinations, and revenge fantasies. People of color are disproportionately subjected to solitary confinement, even beyond their disproportionate representation in the general prison population. Confinement is also costly and counterproductive, increasing recidivism, while failing to reduce prison and jail violence. The bill before us today could further be strengthened by ensuring protection for non-punitive medical isolation, adding transparency to monthly reports being shared with the council, and making clarifying edits to the private right of action and applicability sections. First, we urge the council to protect the medical exemption for segregated confinement within sections 4B and 4C of the legislation. Non-punitive medical isolation is necessary for incarcerated people who are diagnosed with or are suspected of having an infectious disease to prevent disease from spreading to other folks at the facility. Without a medical exemption, the Department of Corrections and DYRS could potentially never engage in medical isolation unless court ordered, and the health and safety of incarcerated people at DC facilities would continue to be at risk. Second, we also urge the committee to strengthen reporting requirements in Section 6. Each department should report information to the independent oversight agency tasked with the oversight of both DOC and DYRS, in addition to the mayor and the council. And those reports should be made publicly available on department websites. This transparency is necessary for the community to understand the steps being taken to eliminate solitary confinement and hold DOC and DYRS accountable for their actions. As currently written, Section 7, which creates a private right of action for an incarcerated person to sue if subjected to solitary confinement, is imprecise. It does not address the Prison Litigation Reform Act and could be read by a court to limit injunctive relief. We recommend revising the law to include robust provisions to enable incarcerated people that end up in solitary confinement to enforce their rights, and to encourage counsel to represent them by including attorney's fees in the private right of action. Solitary confinement is an outdated, painful, and inhumane practice. The District of Columbia can be a leader in ending solitary confinement through the passage of this legislation. But even with these safeguards in place, there must be additional accountability measures to ensure that both DOC and DYRS are implementing and following the law. In addition to passing this legislation, we are also urging the Greater Council to create a new independent oversight entity that would address greater DOC conditions and finally hold DOC accountable for their punitive isolation measures and unconstitutional conditions. The new entity must be empowered to conduct inspections without advance notice, have unfettered access to facilities, residents, and staff, and be required to issue frequent public reports on their findings. We stand ready to work with you and alongside our partners in the Unlock the Box Coalition as you consider this bill. We appreciate the council's leadership on this issue, and I look forward to any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Is Ms. Tammy Seltzer here, and also Katerina Simonova? Okay. You can go ahead, start, Ms. Seltzer.
Thank you. My name is Tammy Seltzer. I'm director of the DC Jail and Prison Advocacy Project, Disability Rights DC at University Legal Services. I am filling in for Natasha Walls-Smith, who is our mitigation and monitoring attorney. And I apologize, our focus in this testimony was on a DOC, but certainly a number of these issues apply to DYRS as well. We are the federally mandated protection and advocacy agency for people with disabilities in the District of Columbia. And under that authority, we're given unaccompanied access to both DOC and DYRS facilities to monitor the conditions of confinement for individuals with psychiatric and intellectual disabilities. We support the general recommendations and underlying principles of the Erase Bill. Solitary confinement is particularly dangerous for people diagnosed with psychiatric disabilities who are grossly overrepresented in both DOC and DYRS. However, the Erase Bill stops short of a full-throated condemnation of solitary confinement and isolation when it comes to using safe cells. The bill allows someone on suicide precaution or watch to be placed in a safe cell if, quote, it is immediately necessary to prevent death or serious bodily injury, and two, the penal institution provides the incarcerated person appropriate medical and mental health care, end quote. This language is easily manipulated and could even be used to justify keeping current policies in place. The act of being placed in a safe cell may very well be considered by some, quote, appropriate medical and mental health care, just as solitary confinement is considered by some suitable discipline. Safe cells need to be eliminated as an option. Residents are entitled to the same treatment when they're detained that they would have received in the community, and this is not a treatment in the community to be confined in a safe cell. The current approach that's being used at DOC is the most harmful interpretation of their policies possible. The bill defines a safe cell as, quote, a housing cell designed to be suicide resistant and designed to prevent self-injurious behavior, end quote. When assigned to a safe cell, residents are isolated and stripped of all possible comforts, as Ms. Nouvelle mentioned, including any compassion you would expect to see in the treatment of someone experiencing a mental health crisis. The goal is to make it physically difficult for residents to attempt death by hanging while in a safe cell. Residents are given what is known as a safety smock or turtle suit, a safety blanket, and a safety mattress, nothing else. These items are designed in a way that's supposed to make it difficult to form a kind of noose. Most residents at the jail need their blanket or a smock to cover and secure the crack underneath to prevent rodents from coming in. So that means they only have one other garment to cover themselves. The result is humiliating and degrading, and it leaves no room for dignity or even basic comfort. This type of isolation is contraindicated for people experiencing suicidal ideation or those at risk of death by suicide. Isolation to this degree can lead to an increase in suicidal ideation. Now, DOC policy doesn't require a complete stripping of almost all items and enjoyment as a standard practice for suicide precaution or watch. The actual policy rightly allows for access to personal property, personal calls, undergarments, slippers, and recreation on a case-by-case analysis. The problem is that these individual suicide treatment plans are not individualized. Treatment plan after treatment plan only differs by the name at the top and rarely anything else. So staff routinely opt for the harshest environment allowed, most likely out of an abundance of caution. If the current safe cell language remains in the bill, we have no doubt that it will be used to justify an over-reliance on solitary confinement as a form of treatment in safe cells. If solitary confinement is unacceptable for discipline, then solitary in the form of safe cells that go beyond the usual solitary restrictions must also be unacceptable. There are part of our team is responsible for monitoring DYRS, and I will bring them into this conversation to help inform the committee as they make their decision. I'm sorry, Councilmember White, you're muted.
Thank you. We will hear now from Ms. Katerina.
Good afternoon. I'm Katerina Semionova, Special Counsel to the Director on Policy and Legislation at the Public Defender Service. PDS represents youth and adults who are held in the district's detention facilities and represents many clients in disciplinary hearings within the Department of Corrections. PDS strongly supports the Erase Bill and urges its prompt passage. Our oral testimony will focus on solitary confinement in safe cells in the DOC because that is the epicenter of the crisis and of the inhumane treatment of district residents. We will provide written testimony regarding DYRS. I didn't see notice that the hearing would focus on DYRS. From a human rights perspective, DOC's treatment of the individuals in its care should be unequivocally condemned. People who are in psychiatric distress, those who are punished for disciplinary infractions, and others with a variety of administrative issues, such as being on protective custody, are routinely held in long-term solitary confinement. Individuals in solitary confinement suffer strikingly consistent psychiatric symptoms, including overwhelming anxiety and depression, hallucinations, severe panic attacks, paranoia, and problems with impulse control. Solitary confinement takes a particularly severe toll on people with mental illness, potentially inflicting permanent and disabling harm. And data shows that more than a third of individuals detained in DOC custody have been diagnosed with a serious mental illness. International bodies and human rights experts have concluded that solitary confinement may constitute cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment and torture. The Mandela rules ban it for youth, people with mental illness, and for more than 15 days. Similarly, a U.S. Department of Justice report concluded that solitary confinement can cause serious, long-lasting harm and should be used rarely and never as a default solution. The DOJ report noted that a growing chorus of correctional officials, policymakers, and reform advocates has called for substantial limitations on the use of restrictive housing. Despite this growing consensus against solitary confinement, the DOC steadfastly continues the practice of solitary confinement while calling it disciplinary or administrative segregation or safe cell placement. Solitary confinement is disproportionately inflicted upon the district's Black residents because they are overwhelmingly disproportionately represented in the district's criminal legal system after being failed by other systems. Given the inadequate mental health treatment the district makes available to some of the district's poorest residents, the use of solitary confinement by the DOC demonstrates an alarming, devastating, and callous disregard for the most vulnerable residents in our communities. In March 2022, Director Faust admitted that DOC forces 12 to 13% of its population into restrictive housing, a rate that is more than double the national average. People in disciplinary and administrative restrictive housing or segregation, solitary confinement by any other name, are locked alone in their cells nearly 24 hours a day. On weekdays, they can have 2 hours of out-of-cell time, again alone in a recreation cage. On weekends, they remain locked in their cells for 48 hours. They do not participate in meaningful educational or religious programming and at best get written materials to review in their cells. People in disciplinary segregation are denied social visits and phone calls. This solitary confinement can last for 30 days, and DOC frequently imposes successive 30-day sanctions without honoring their own policy of a 48-hour break between confinement periods. Those in administrative segregation can spend months in solitary confinement with only cursory reviews. Adding to the degrading treatment, people in both disciplinary and administrative solitary confinement move within the DOC in full restraints, meaning leg irons, handcuffs, and a belly chain. Under DOC policy, individuals must kneel on the floor in front of their bunk until leg irons are applied. DOC allows the removal of restraints during medical treatment in the event of a life-threatening emergency and if removal of the restraints is absolutely necessary for treatment. Despite being in full-body restraints, DOC demands that all individuals entering or exiting the segregation unit for any reason be strip searched for contraband. These policies and practices promulgated by Director Faust in 2012 maximize deprivation and dehumanization experienced by the resident. Detention in a safe cell. The way that DOC purports to keep suicidal residents safe was likened to Abu Ghraib by one resident. DOC's response to this resident being suicidal and depressed was confining her alone in a freezing and constantly illuminated and filthy cell without running water to flush the toilet or wash her hands, where she was naked except for a safety smock, which consisted of a rough blanket held together with Velcro, and where she had only a hard plastic surface for a bed. DOC's 2017 policy changes to safe cells, which if implemented with fidelity would guarantee such basics as running water, still allow for an environment that amounts to torture and that only deepens despair. The Council should be beyond concerned that DOC safe cells deter people from self-reporting suicidal thoughts and have contributed to the deaths that occurred there over the year. There is stark and undeniable need for legislation to address DOC's policies and practices and the torturous and inhumane conditions that DOC inflicts on residents. PDS's full written testimony includes further information about these conditions and drafting requests. Council oversight is not enough. The Council must legislate to require humane treatment. Thank you for advancing this critically important legislation.
Thank you so much. So let's start with our first round of questionings. Ms. Holbrook. We'll come back to you, Ms. Holbrook, if you can be patient with us for a moment. I want to go back to Ms. Novell real quick. First of all, thank you for being vulnerable and expressing firsthand information about your experiences in solitary confinement. Just sorry that happened to you, but also for your advocacy. You know, some people take that pain and swallow it up and it eventually consumes them and changes them, but you took that pain and turned it into purpose. And we appreciate what you are doing. One of the things you highlighted in speaking was that the physical harm that it did to your body. And can you speak to that as relates to what you've seen, heard, and saw about other things that's happening in solitary confinement that may be unhealthy to the mental and to the body?
Sure. Food is another problem. We all know that prison jail food is not good anyway, but because you're supposed to be given finger food, there's a lack of access to healthy food. I think that there's also, I got a UTI while I was there a couple of times because in the DC jail, like as Ms. Seltzer pointed out, there's no running water, and in the BOP, you have to knock to have them come unlock the bathroom, and they do that at their will. So that caused UTIs, and that's what caused the kidney stones. I also have something. I have a physical condition where I'm required to take Xarelto because I get blood clots in my legs. And when you're on suicide watch, there's always a delay in getting any medication you're assigned. And so for me, I ended up having problems with my legs and my back, the freezing cold, I can't, Ms. Seltzer mentioned that as well. There is something about being kept so cold. Studies show that suicide increases for people who are kept in cold temperatures for long periods of time. So that physically affects your body. I mean, I'm 52. I was 40 something when this happened to me. And so, you know, the toll it took on my body is that I still have the lasting effects. And I also wanted to say that while it looks like I turn my pain into purpose, I'm grateful that you see that, but I also just want to say something is that I still suffer from this. I still suffer the nightmares of being put at the DC jail. I was put in solitary confinement, and I didn't want to focus on that because I feel like not enough attention has been given to the safe cells. But even in when I was put on in solitary confinement in the DC jail, it was done because someone didn't like me, and that caused me during that time period to actually cut. Sorry, my Ring doorbell's going off. That caused me in that situation to cut on myself. And so that took its toll. And mind you, nobody was coming by to see if I was suicidal with the DLC. And I was. I don't know what's happening outside my door. I'm very sorry. I was suicidal. In the end, I got shipped to Northern Neck Jail. And this is really important because I don't know if we're still shipping people to Northern Neck Regional Jail. But I can tell you that when I was at Northern Neck Regional Jail, I was put on suicide watch, and they didn't even have a mattress. I slept on a metal bunk in the cold. And so, you know, and again, I look the way I look because I work very hard, and I will be in therapy for the rest of my life from pre-prison trauma, but also because of the trauma I experienced while I was incarcerated. And that trauma was from segregation, and it was from safe cells.
Thank you. And I know we're focusing on DYRS, but I even heard Miss Katarina say that, but we also, I want to hear about, you know, also our current DC jail, which I visit often as well. I know I have oversight over DYRS, but we still have other council members who'll be listening on that are on the other committees as well. So feel free to talk about that as well, because there are some greater concerns, because we know there are a number of youth who transition, unfortunately, to our adult penal system. And I know, Ms. Taylor, you said that you did not agree with the bill in its current form and had a few suggestions. What do you see as suggestions to improve the bill as relates to youth and young adults?
Okay, so for me, for the bill, I think Ms. Seltzer alluded to this as well. The way it is in its current state, it gives room to really manipulate and hold people longer. It also gives room to say, we're going to put this person in a facility outside of the jail. And again, that could lead to people being held longer than they would be if they stayed at the jail. Imagine having a 6-month sentence and someone deciding that you're suicidal and taking you out of the jail to St. E's or to Washington Hospital Mental Health Center. Imagine that happening, and you're held there for, if you're at St. E's, they could say, we're going to hold you indefinitely because we see this happening. It can interfere with your rights with your criminal case. And so that needs to be really flushed out. And again, I'll say this, Ms. Seltzer said it, and I know if Natasha Wall-Smith was here, she would say it. I do not think there is any reason to be stripping someone of their clothing, putting them in a quilted gown in a freezing cold cell with the lights on them, having to ask for permission to use the bathroom, being fed food you would not give to a dog. There is no reason. That is cruel and unusual punishment, and it is torture. The bill needs to be very clear. And Ms. Wasser mentioned the third-party oversight committee, which people are advocating for. I'm a part of advocating for that. We need a committee that is independent of the DOC that actually goes in or can demand reports on when the use of suicide watch is happening, who's making these recommendations? Because I tell you, you can tell there's certain officers who will repeatedly abuse this power and put people they don't like on suicide watch or in solitary. The only way we can really safely ensure someone's well-being and not harming themselves is if we have a third party saying, these are the guidelines, and if this person is suicidal, we need to have some outside help. But I don't think, as Ms. Seltzer said, even in the free world, no one would ever strip you of your clothing, tell you when you could use the bathroom, feed you food that you're supposed to eat with your fingers, leave you in the cold with lights on it. I've been in mental health facilities and that never happened to me. Nobody kept the light on me all night. I got to wear my regular clothes. And so the bill needs to be really detailed. And I'm not a person that writes bills. I'm a person who advocates for them. So all I can do is tell you from my own experience what didn't work and what I believe would work.
Thank you. Well, we have a number of lawyers on my team who can take what you have and mark it up to improve the bill. And we'll be working with our colleagues and their staff as well. I want to jump to you, Ms. Wasser. Does the ACLU work with youth in Washington, D.C. in any capacity? Do you have a youth arm of the organization?
Thank you so much for the question, Council Member. I'd have to go back to our team and check, but I know we have organizers within the community that interact with the community on a variety of issues, and so I'd be happy to follow up with your team on that.
All right. Do you all have any cases through DYRS that you all are supporting or working on or advocating for?
Again, I can check with our legal team on that. I know the focus of our testimony today was on DOC, as other witnesses may have mentioned, and I know that there was a lawsuit through our legal team addressing the conditions at the DC jail, especially dealing with the COVID-19 lockdown, where DC held folks in the jail for, I think it was over 500 days, that did not help stop the spread of COVID. In fact, DC had one of the highest rates of COVID-19 caused by mass incarceration in the country.
Yep, and I actually was visiting the facility during that time, and just saw the materials that they were using just to clean the cells and facilities. And it was just, even last week, I got a call from a family member of an inmate who was in a facility, in a cell that his roommate had COVID, and they never removed him from that facility. And so I communicated with the director of the agency to try to correct it, but it's still ongoing, even though this, COVID-19 started in 2019, really hit in 2020, it's still ongoing inside the facility. And not to even mention monkeypox, that also was an issue inside our facilities as well. Thank you. I guess because most of my questions are DYRS related. I didn't know, Ms. Seltzer, if you had anything to add as relates to our New Beginnings or YSC facility as relates to this bill and confinement of youth. And I say that to say because I went to DYRS probably about 8 months ago, and it was a young man who was there, and I guess when he didn't know who I was, because he came up to me, he was like, who are you? And we were joking around, and I told him who I was. He was like, man, because they've been running around fixing everything up, saying this important guy was coming here. They weren't doing this yesterday. And he was telling me they had moved some of the young people to another side of the facility. And I was, trying to get a feel for why he was there. He was from Maryland. He got caught in DC. He said he was in intake for 23 hours. And pretty much saying he was in solitary confinement. It wasn't the traditional solitary confinement, but he was in a cell by himself. And he was just saying, man, he shouldn't be here all this time in his cell by himself. And he was hoping, because he feel like I was important, that I can help fix that. And so that also adds to this conversation today. In your testimony, Ms. Seltzer, you stated the treatment plan only differ by name and staff routinely opt for the harshest environment allowed. Can you elaborate on that?
I can, and I also, a couple of things. I do want to take a few seconds to share with you what's going on at the jail with the mental health unit, because I think that's important. But also this issue around choosing the harshest option. The policies allow for less harsh options. The policies do not require people to be stripped of all of their clothing, to not be allowed. They allow people to have personal items like reading material, but in every case, that is disallowed by the person who is doing the individualized assessment about what people should or should not be allowed. That does not feel very individualized to me if everybody's ending up with the same thing, which is you can't have anything except, your turtle suit, a blanket and a mattress. The only reason that there are mattresses and things are because of advocacy from our organization, PDS, whoever else has been involved in different advocacy around this. There have been times when we have gone to the jail and found clients naked, found someone who he's now deceased, but he was there putting squares of toilet paper on the floor because it was so cold, and he was just doing whatever he could to try and get warmer. But that's not enough, deciding that you're not really going to individualize things because you are overly concerned about something may happen and we're going to be responsible, which I think is maybe Unity's perspective, Unity Healthcare is making those decisions. It's not acceptable. And even this automatic, you go to a safe cell, as Ms. Nouvelle was saying, that is not the standard. And in 2013, DOC under Director Faust asked suicide expert Lindsay Hayes to come in and take a look at what was happening around suicide and suicide prevention. And even though he talked about, how to run safe cells properly, he also said, not required. People should not automatically be required to be isolated, to have, their clothes taken away from them. They should be getting mental health treatment in a therapeutic environment. And one of the things that he talked about was the difference between housing people with mental illness in a unit versus running a real mental health unit. A mental health unit would be something that focuses on trauma, focuses on actually treating people, having groups running, having individual therapy, having just a lot of supports and services for the individuals there. Some of that is happening on the mental health step-down unit, not happening on the acute mental health unit. And I really want to point out that right now, the entire South 3, the entire mental health unit is being run as if it's a solitary unit. People are only getting out of their cells 1 to 2 hours a day, while they don't have access to tablets like other people in the jail and CTF have. Nobody can seem to explain why that is or when conditions are going to change. This is what I found almost 10 years ago when I started this job and said, this looks like solitary to me. And people are like, oh, I guess maybe it is. And so then changes were made. People got more out of cell time on the mental health unit. They got exercise bites. They got, at least a weekly or twice weekly group. Still not adequate, but definitely an improvement. And to see sort of post-pandemic, how everything has really fallen apart. They've definitely gone back to running the whole unit as a solitary unit. And in addition to that, it is absolutely chaotic. Everybody's yelling. There's frustration about being in their cells. Natasha Wall-Smith, who was going to testify, when she goes to monitor and tries to talk to the people who are in the safe cells, they're having to pause and wait in between people chanting and yelling about getting out of their cells, because people are not being given that opportunity. So I think that it's important that everybody on the council knows that this is what's happening in what's supposed to be the mental health treatment unit at the jail. And we do, I will also say, we do have people in my office who are focused on DYRS, and I will make sure that they have an opportunity in writing or some other, or maybe through meetings, to report to you specifically about DYRS in this bill.
That would be extremely helpful because we got to go through markup.
Yes, sir.
Any further comments, Ms. Katerina?
No, thank you so much for holding this hearing, and we will also provide further written comments. They'll just be more precise than if I do them orally on the DYRS piece. So
Gotcha.
we'll have that for your team.
I appreciate that. All right. Thank you, guys. We're going to move to the next panel. I know Ms. Holbrook was already here. Ms. Holbrook, David Lindsay, Jessica Sandoval, Devin Smith, and David Sample. Excuse me. While we're elevating them, you can go ahead and start, Ms. Holbrook.
Hello, Councilmember White and members of the committee. My name is Caitlin Holbrook, and I'm a policy advocate and research associate at DC Justice Lab, which leads the DC chapter of the Unlock the Box Coalition in partnership with the National Campaign to End Solitary Confinement. First, I want to thank you for this important hearing. I hope it will inspire the Committee on Judiciary and Public Safety to also hold a hearing on this vital legislation. Washington, D.C. is infamous for deplorable conditions inside our adult correctional facilities and our over-reliance on incarceration, particularly for Black adults and children. Solitary confinement is one condition that we can fix now. We define solitary confinement as any form of isolating and confining in one space for more than 18 hours a day in a 24-hour period, away from other people, depriving them of meaningful human interaction. The Erase Bill targets solitary confinement under its many pseudonyms, including in the DOC, restrictive housing, administrative segregation, disciplinary segregation, protective custody, safe cells, and medical stay in place, and in the DYRS, room confinement. This committee oversees DYRS, and truthfully, as the bill is currently written, it does not substantially change the standards already in place through the Comprehensive Youth Justice Amendment Act. However, we have some proposed amendments that would further improve upon the CYJAA standards. Those changes include more precise reporting requirements, making collected data publicly available, limiting the use of room confinement during recreation time, and requiring documentation of less restrictive methods tried before room confinement. However, I think the biggest takeaway is that in the district, we have already seen a positive result from decreasing the use of solitary confinement through the CYJAA, and the DOC must follow DYRS's example and end solitary confinement. The Erase Bill ends solitary confinement in DOC by separating and defining isolation and confinement and when correctional facilities can use either. The bill does this because there are times when people need to be isolated but not confined, or there are times when people need to be confined but not isolated. For example, isolation can be used for cases when people test positive for COVID-19, but that person does not need to be confined to one space for 23 hours. Conversely, an individual who may need to be confined, such as recovering from surgery, does not need to be isolated from meaningful human interaction. The Erase Bill also establishes requirements that correctional facilities attempt de-escalation and treat mental health crises rather than defaulting to isolation and confinement. The bill requires correctional facilities to transfer the individual to a therapeutic setting if they cannot meet the standards established in the bill based on the American College of Emergency Physicians' proposed medical bill of rights for detained and incarcerated people while receiving emergency medical care. Solitary confinement is widely agreed upon to cause horrific psychiatric and physical consequences and constitutes torture under international law. Its over-reliance in DC is fueled by an inability or an unwillingness to pursue alternatives that have proven to make facilities and communities safer in other countries and other United States jurisdictions. Examples of alternatives in other states include establishing a restorative justice program, such as in Maine, and individual resource officers for conflict mediation, such as in Oregon. However, the best alternatives to solitary confinement include investing in the well-being of individuals and centering humanity rather than punishing the symptoms of neglect and abuse afflicted on those inside our jails by our jails. I asked the committee to bring us one step closer to ending torture in DC by passing the Erase Solitary Confinement Act. It is time to end a practice that not only decreases the safety of our loved ones in the jails, ourselves, and our community, but to invest in alternatives that match the value of DC and its residents. We want a safe and free DC for all people. I thank you for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much. David Lindsay. Mhm. I don't see Mr. Lindsay here. Jessica Sandoval.
Hi, everyone.
Hello.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairperson White and the committee. My name is Jessica Sandoval, and I lead the Unlock the Box campaign. It's a 10-year campaign to end solitary confinement in the U.S. Thank you very much for the committee for holding a hearing on this urgent matter for the opportunity to testify. We join the chorus of voices calling to end solitary confinement. Solitary confinement in the district continues to pose an urgent human, health, and racial justice crisis, one that can be remedied by the proposed bill in front of you. You have the authority to end this barbaric practice, and we urge the DC City Council to immediately pass the Erase Act. As you've heard from everyone today, solitary is torture. It causes immense suffering, devastating mental, physical, and emotional harm. Evidence shows that, in fact, the opposite of solitary confinement, like providing people full days out of cell with pro-social engagement and programming, increases safety. One example of this is the Resolve to Stop Violence project in San Francisco jails. For example, it involves full days of out-of-cell congregate programming, and it saw violence among participants in the program literally dropped to zero over a 1-year period studied. In addition, they had financial savings. Similarly, the Merle Cooper program and the Clinical Alternatives to Punitive Segregation program in New York use therapeutic, rehabilitative, and empowerment-based approaches without isolation and have seen positive outcomes on safety and people's well-being. Passing the Erase Act would bring the District of Columbia in line with its neighboring states and the growing trend to end solitary across the country. In 2022 alone, 130 pieces of legislation were filed across 29 states and Congress to end aspects of solitary confinement in state prisons and jails. DC should join our northeastern neighbors, Connecticut, New York, and New Jersey, who have all recently passed legislation that also ban and severely restrict solitary in prisons and jails. One additional trend that's worth noting that we've been monitoring over the last few years is the move towards ending solitary for youth. The Federal First Step Act fully banned the use of room confinement in youth facilities other than for up to a maximum of 30 minutes in instances where there was a risk of self-harm, and up to a maximum of 3 hours in instances where there was a risk of harm to others. The DC Council has the opportunity and responsibility to address the humanitarian crisis happening in our jails and youth facility. Solitary confinement is an abhorrent practice that causes extreme suffering and harm without any benefit. It should have been banned in DC and across the country long ago. The Erase Act will take critical and bold steps to ending solitary confinement and ensuring that our incarcerated residents will never again be subjected to this torture. Thank you for your time and thoughtful consideration of this urgent matter. I'd also like to mention that my colleague from the Center for Children's Law and Policy was unavailable for today's hearing, but will be submitting testimony focused on youth solitary for the record and is available to you and your staff and any others to answer questions you may have about youth and solitary specifically. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Reverend Lindsay has joined us. So you can go right ahead, sir.
Well, thank you so much, Councilmember White, and to all of you from the DC Council. Thank you for this opportunity. I bring you greetings from Interfaith Action for Human Rights, and on behalf of our retiring Executive Director, Rabbi Charles Feinberg, we're grateful to you that you are considering this very important issue. I'm Reverend Dr. David B. Lindsay, the incoming Executive Director of Interfaith Action for Human Rights, and for those that don't know us, just want to let you know that we represent people of faith who educate and advocate in Maryland, DC, and Virginia for correction systems that avoid unnecessarily punitive practices such as solitary confinement, and that instead focus on rehabilitation and successful reentry. Juan Mendez, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture and Other Cruel or Degrading Treatment or Punishment, established that placing anyone in isolation for more than 15 consecutive days is an act of torture. There is growing scientific and scholarly evidence that long-term isolation has negative psychological effects on the human psyche. The evidence underscores the importance of social contact for both physical and psychological well-being. Depriving individuals of such contact leads to a range of deleterious consequences. Stuart Gracian, a board-certified psychiatrist and a former faculty member at Harvard Medical School, has interviewed hundreds of prisoners in solitary confinement, sometimes called restrictive housing. In one study, he found that roughly a third of solitary inmates were actively psychotic and/or acutely suicidal. Gracian has since concluded that solitary can cause a specific psychiatric syndrome characterized by hallucinations, panic attacks, overt paranoia, diminished impulse control, hypersensitivity to external stimuli, and difficulties with thinking, concentration, and memory. Some of those who are incarcerated lose the ability to maintain a state of alertness, while others develop crippling obsessions. The Eliminating Restrictive and Segregated Enclosures, or Erase Solitary Confinement Act, ends solitary confinement and severely limits the use of safe cells in DOC facilities. The Erase Bill separates and defines isolation and confinement and makes clear when it is appropriate for the DOC to use each without engaging in prolonged solitary confinement. For example, suppose a person has a medical ailment requiring them to be on bed rest. In that case, they can be confined to one space without being isolated from meaningful interaction with other people, as we've heard from our other panelists. Conversely, someone with COVID-19 can be isolated without being confined to one space, meaning they can have time outside or out of their cell. The Erase Bill limits the use of safe cells, requiring that the DOC meet the mental health care standards deemed appropriate by the American College of Emergency Physicians' proposed Medical Bill of Rights for detained and incarcerated persons while receiving emergency medical care. Otherwise, the individual must be transferred to a medical facility where they can receive treatment. When dealing with conflict, there are various options for DOC to engage in other than solitary confinement, such as isolating while not confining, or, similar to CTF, separating people by units. IAHR has interviewed wardens and superintendents of jails and prisons, and one such person is Richard Van Wickler, who was a superintendent of a New Hampshire jail for 23 years. He has testified that with proper training, no one needs to be isolated for more than 15 days. In fact, during the time he was superintendent, no incarcerated person was ever isolated for more than 7 days. Moreover, ending prolonged isolation does not undermine the security of a prison or jail. The opposite is in fact the case. Facilities that have reduced solitary confinement have seen fewer assaults between correctional officers and incarcerated persons, and between two people incarcerated in the facility. We can look at the Maine Department of Corrections, Oregon, and the Colorado juvenile facilities as examples. Currently, in the Department of Youth Services, room confinement is limited to no more than 6 hours, as established in the Comprehensive Youth Justice Amendment Act of 2016. We often see children in a cool-down procedure where they spend no more than an hour in their rooms behind the door, except in special cases. Limiting solitary confinement in a correctional setting for youth in D.C., even in cases of conflict and mental health crisis, has already been a success. Knowing that we have done this before in Washington, D.C., while increasing the safety of all D.C. residents, should be motivation and encouragement for us to achieve and implement these changes for adults in the D.C. Department of Corrections. It is time that we end torture in the D.C. Department of Corrections. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Devin Smith, go right ahead.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Councilmember White and committee, and thank you for the opportunity to speak today in support of the Erase Bill to end solitary confinement in Washington, D.C. So as you said, my name is Devin Smith, and I am representing the social impact firm Ship and Anchor and the nonprofit Voices Unbarred. And today I'm sincerely urging the D.C. Council to pass the Eliminating Restrictive and Segregated Enclosures Act, Solitary Confinement Amendment Act of 2022, and torture in Washington, D.C. After serving as a community advocate for 2 years, I now serve as the president of the board for Voices Unbarred, which is a DC-based nonprofit that uses techniques from theater in its work with people directly impacted by imprisonment and incarceration, including those who are currently behind bars. We use these techniques to advocate for the changes that we wish to see in the system from our lived experiences and to heal from those experiences of incarceration. And much to my surprise, I have found this work largely helpful in my journey to simply reclaiming myself after my own experience of incarceration back in college. Now, serving in this way is not something that I envisioned for myself, not because I didn't believe in my competence for the role, or because I don't have a heart for service, or because it's an unpaid volunteer role, but or not even because I also have been working as a full-time entrepreneur trying to grow my own business during COVID. But instead, I didn't envision this kind of work for myself, that is advocacy for reforming the criminal legal system, because of the time that I spent incarcerated. As deeply as I support this work, I didn't want to be a part of it because of the intensity of the trauma and triggers that I still work intentionally and diligently to heal from to this day. To me, it didn't feel worth it to have to deal with some of those triggers and things, to have something so impactful in my life and the experiences of those who I love politicized, as I viewed. However, I now realize and feel that the more I share my truth about these matters, the more that I heal and help move progress forward, even if only in a small way. And I truly believe that the council is full of very intelligent people who I do believe want what's best for the District of Columbia and its residents, no matter your differences. And this is why I urge each of you not to skirt your good judgment in exchange for ignorance. There's a preponderance of evidence that affirm that solitary confinement is in fact torture and has long-lasting physical and mental effects even after release, as so many of my counterparts have shared very eloquently today. The use of harmful policies such as solitary confinement is why, after returning home from post-release and completing my degree at a top-ranked institution and climbing the corporate ladder in an international economic development agency, and just 4 years of my release, I still fell victim to recidivism, something I told myself that I would not do. So the data is not lying, and nor are my counterparts who have testified today. Part of why I left my home state, North Carolina, with only desperation for the opportunity to live out my vision of being a productive member of society, is because DC actually is a bit more hospitable for people staying with the blemish of a felony. Passing the Erase Bill is an opportunity for you to continue leading with smart, innovative, and impactful policy that will make DC jail safer, help reduce recidivism, and empower people being released from DC jail to live healthy, productive lives and be a benefit to the entire district. DC jail employs solitary confinement 3 times the national average. And so I appeal today to your better judgment and end the torture of solitary confinement and accept the aspects of the Erase Bill. DC residents do not want the DC government to torture us, our neighbors, or our loved ones. The DC DOC and DYRS should invest in alternatives to solitary confinement to reduce violence and mental health crisis, to increase community, individual, and facility safety. I am proud of the council for this first step towards ending this archaic practice, and I hope that we continue to center humanity in our policies around the jails to become a model of how we can rethink incarceration and public safety. Thank you again for this hearing and allowing me to testify, and I am happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that. We'll come back in a moment. We have one final witness on this panel, David Samper. Is David Samper here? All right. All right, I don't think he is here. Okay. So Miss Sandoval. Okay, Ms. Holbrook right here. Thank you for your comments, Ms. Holbrook. Noting that the Comprehensive Youth Justice Amendment Act has improved conditions at DYRS. Can you provide us with your written testimony, repeat and elaborate on how that's improved and what else we can be doing to improve the living conditions for youth and young adults in our juvenile detention facilities?
Yeah, I'll definitely add more in my testimony. I know that the bill was written in a scope that really focused on DSC, and the Comprehensive Youth Justice Amendment Act already restricted room confinement to 6 hours, as was said in other testimonies. We're currently looking through the bill where we can put amendments and trying to get consensus from the coalition on those, and I can add the proposed amendments in my testimony, my written testimony that I listed in my oral testimony.
Thank you. Let me jump over to Ms. Jessica Sandoval. You mentioned in other states that we have banned solitary confinement. Where? Do you have that on hand?
I actually can provide it in my testimony in a
Okay.
more proficient way. So there have been several pieces of legislation that have banned solitary for what we call vulnerable populations, like young people,
Okay.
those with mental illness, people with medical conditions and disabilities. So I can provide a more comprehensive list for that. And then we recently in New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut, solitary was banned for those populations. And in addition to that, was limited to 15 days or less.
Okay. If you can send that to me, that'd be helpful. I heard you went to some of the states, so I just want to make sure we
Sure.
research that and figure out how that's working. Reverend Lindsay, you talked about the erase bill and separating isolation and confinement in your testimony. Do you have any other suggestions to improve the bill?
We are in favor of the bill as it stands, but we definitely welcome the recommendations of so many of the panelists that you've heard today. And so our primary concern is that as people of faith and of diverse faith traditions, we're opposed to torture. And anything more than 15 days in solitary is defined, as we've said, as torture after repeated studies as well as anecdotal experiences from those that you've heard here. One of the things that I would just say as a religious leader in the community would be that all faith traditions, we disagree about many things, but we all agree that people are created for community and that people are created for relationship. And so one of the things that we would recommend is just that any opportunities for people to remain in community as families, as friends, go a very long way to helping prevent recidivism, but also to helping the well-being of those who are incarcerated and the youth who are in our community who are not incarcerated, but may have a significant family member who is, and who, for one reason or another, may be difficult to visit. And so
I agree with that. When I got on the council, I noted in several hearings my objection to a lot of our youth being transported outside of the city. The number was extremely high. And I worked with the former director and now new director, Karen, to bring those youth back home to figure out what we can do locally to provide specific services for those who needed more services. So I agree with that wholeheartedly. We have done a number of things to improve that those youth who are here. So thank you for that. Jump to Mr. Smith. In your testimony, you discussed techniques. Can you elaborate on what techniques you use that can help with mental health residents with lived experiences?
Sure. So what we employ specifically in Voices Unbarred is a technique called Theater of the Oppressed. It's actually a framework for teaching and discussing social justice issues and things like that in a way that I have found very helpful. And, like I said, I've been a part and have, been serious about therapy for many years, since 2011, in fact. But it wasn't until participating with Voices Unbarred where I was in a space where I could share my experience with other folks who identified, understood, and build community that allowed me to really heal in a way that freed me up more than I expected. And I actually learned of Voices Unbarred work through a program I was involved in. And at that point, I started my business, and I honestly wanted to kind of partner with them. But when I started participating in the work, I was surprised at how relieved I felt and how much more of myself I was able to reclaim, which kind of, I think how Reverend Dr. Lindsay mentioned, that difference is that community and relationship. So those are some of the techniques, and in doing that, right, sharing our experiences in those spaces, we also develop the confidence and the skills to be able to do what I'm doing now, right, which is advocate for some of these changes. Again, I believe that these are important, but I didn't want to do it, right, because it's like reliving that wound. But having that space, it allowed me to, develop that confidence that, I could do that. And I do believe that, more of our voices should be a part of these conversations.
I totally agree. I did want to know just a general question to the panel. What does deprivation of human touch mean, or what's the consequences of that in you all's experience? Anyone can chime in, because that's been a recurring theme in this discussion.
I can start. We know that solitary confinement or deprivation of a meaningful interaction with other people can lead to some pretty severe mental health crises, such as psychosis, suicide, self-harming behavior. Opioid addiction is increased. Death by opioid addiction is increased. We also know that, it physically changes the way that your body is. So it shrinks parts of your brain. It affects your eyesight from being able to see long distances. And then beyond that, there's a social aspect of it. Being able to be set up for success upon reentering into the community is completely stunted by depriving people of meaningful and human interaction. It decreases the likelihood of getting a job after reentering the community. It causes social conversations to be challenging. So there's just a wide, varied list of ramifications that come from not being able to meaningful interact with other people and meaningfully be able to move around a space that's not completely confined. And then also include allowing time to be outside with fresh air, seeing the sun. That's increasingly important. So that's what I'll highlight. And yeah, I'll pass it on to my other panelists.
Anyone else want to chime in on that?
Yes, I'll definitely jump in. So definitely agree with everything Caitlin mentioned. But for me, the word that keeps popping up in my mind is objectification, right? In this whole way of seeing yourself as not a part of this, these interpersonal connections, right? And like she mentioned is, one of the things I still work on unlearning and embracing is that part of one of the ways you learn to survive is by getting used and accustomed to not being able to be affectionate, right? Not being able to tell people that you love them or give them hugs. And so even now being out, I have struggled with maintaining relationships, because I can go months without even speaking to people that I care very deeply for, right? But the strain that causes on those relationships, right? Without me even realizing it, right? Because it just becomes life and second nature. But as we all mentioned, that's not what being human as it is, right, and about.
Yep. Thank you. I know, Ms. Sandoval, you mentioned or referenced that racial justice is an issue with regards to solitary confinement. Can you elaborate on what that is and what's the psychology behind it being racial and effects of it?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. So what we know about the disproportionate racial bias in solitary confinement from the little research that actually exists is that, and it shows up very much like this in the District of Columbia, which is most people who are in solitary confinement are people of color. And partially that's because we, lock up people of color. And so that's who we find oftentimes are then subject to this kind of torture. In the District of Columbia, 92.5% of people in the carceral system in DC are Black. And there's just no way around the fact that this is a racial justice issue and one that can be solved by legislative action.
Thank you. I see we're joined by my Ward 4 colleague, Councilmember Janice Lewis George. Do you have any questions for this panel? Opening statement?
Yes, thank you. I did not get to hear the panel, so I don't have any specific questions, but I will give my opening, and then if there's any things to add to that, then I can address it to the panel. So good afternoon to everyone, and I'm sorry to be jumping into this hearing late. It was a busy day in the council today, but I want to pop by quickly to thank my colleague, Committee Chair Trayon White, for holding this hearing today on eliminating restrictive and segregated enclosures, Solitary Confinement Act of 2022, which I was proud to co-introduce. Ending solitary confinement means enhancing rehabilitation outcomes in our correctional facilities. Human beings are fundamentally social creatures. What solitary confinement does is strip us of our very humanity. It reduces executive function and social skills, and is especially counterproductive when it's used with young people whose social emotional development can be severely and permanently impaired. If people are leaving our jails more broken than when they came in, we are failing our city. Simply put, solitary confinement is cruel, and no redemption can be achieved through cruelty. I want to thank all the witnesses today for testifying, and I look forward to working alongside my colleagues to end this harmful practice in the district. We have an absolute ability to tackle this humanitarian issue, and as stated by one of our witnesses, this racial justice issue in the ways that it impacts the district. So thank you again, and I look forward to working together, Councilmember Trayon White, to get this through to the committee of the whole. Thanks.
Thank you. Now we will jump. Thank you all who came and gave value to what we're trying to do to correct our penal system that for decades been the justice system has been unjust, as you know. So it's our duty to fix it. So we have a number of measures, including this one, that's designed to help fix the criminal justice system here in DC, and those who are from DC and spread it throughout the country. And this is a heartbeat of mine, and so I appreciate you all on the front line advocating for those that need us to be a voice for them when they can't be a voice for themselves. So thank you all. We're going to jump to our government witnesses. Today we are joined by DYS Director Hillary Kearns. Welcome. Yeah, sorry, I'm in and out of hearings as well. And I don't know if you all saw it was a fight on the bus where the young people had assaulted a lady and threw her off the back of the bus a few days ago. So we're in a conference call with her as well. So we're juggling like 3 different things, but we're glad you all came. We look forward to hearing from you, Director. As you know, it's the practice of this committee to swear in and affirm all government witnesses. If you or your staff will be speaking today, want to ask them to come on screen and start by raising their right hand.
Make that trip down.
Is Adam testifying today?
Not planning to testify, no. He's
Okay,
just-
so it's just you. All
Yes.
right. You can start by raising your right hand. Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give today to the Committee on Recreation, Libraries, and Youth Affairs is the truth and the whole truth?
Yes, I do.
Thank you. If you have an opening statement, you can start there.
I do. Thank you.
Okay.
Good afternoon, Chairperson White and members of the Committee on Recreation, Libraries, and Youth Affairs. My name is Hillary Cairns, and I'm the Director of the Department of Youth Rehabilitation Services. And I would like to thank you for the opportunity to testify on behalf of Mayor Muriel Bowser on the Erase Bill. First, I want to thank your office for continuing to advocate for legislation that has the best interests of our youth in mind. However, we believe this legislation is unnecessary for DYRS due to our current practice and the current law regarding room confinement for youth under DYRS's care. In 2016, Mayor Bowser's administration and the council unanimously supported the Comprehensive Youth Justice Amendment Act of 2016, otherwise known as CYJAA, which became law in April of 2017. Within the CYJAA, there's a provision titled Limitations on the Use of Room Confinement, and it specifically prohibits DYRS from using room confinement for the purposes of discipline, punishment, administrative convenience, retaliation, or staff shortages. It requires that any youth involuntarily under room confinement be screened by a mental health professional within 1 hour after placement. And most importantly, it limits the use of room confinement to less than 6 hours. If the youth is not ready to return to programming after 6 hours, then DYRS must either transfer the young person to a mental health facility or provide specialized individual programming until they are ready to program with the units. Even with these requirements in the CYJAA, it's really important to note that we vastly exceed these standards. When a DYRS resident is placed in room confinement, staff must inform the resident of the reasons for room confinement and that they will be released upon regaining self-control. Our staff also provide one-on-one crisis intervention and continual supervision, never leaving the young person in confinement unsupervised for longer than 15 minutes. If enacted, the Erase Act would eliminate any segregated confinement for more than 18 hours within a 24-hour period, or limit the use of segregated confinement to no more than 10 hours in a 24-hour period. These limitations are less stringent than the current law and our current practice. We don't have youth confined to their rooms for anywhere near this amount of time. In fact, just of note, so in this year, so calendar year 2022, we've had 63 young people who have required room confinement, and the average time has been 43 minutes. Additionally, the Erase Act proposes limitations on using safe cells for residents placed on suicide precaution or suicide watch. DYRS does not use safe cells for our residents experiencing suicidal ideations. Our current practice, which follows the standards set by the National Commission on Correctional Healthcare, is as follows. If a young person is on suicide precaution status, or SPS, they're classified as either SPS 1 or SPS 2. SPS 1 is the more high-risk status, requiring a dedicated staff to be within 5 feet of the resident at all hours, day and night. SPS 2 requires the youth to be observed by the assigned unit staff at staggered intervals not to exceed every 10 minutes, day and night. The duration of both SPS statuses is based on the clinical judgment of the behavioral health and medical staff. Our agency is proud of all the changes we've made to significantly reduce room confinement altogether, to reduce room confinement and to better protect our most vulnerable residents suffering from suicidal ideations. These changes did not occur in a vacuum. It took a collaborative effort driven by our staff, Mayor Bowser's administration, the juvenile justice advocate community, and the council. For these reasons, we do not feel the legislation is necessary to improve the treatment of youth under our care. However, if enacted, we will comply with the requirements in both the CYJAA and the Erase Act. Thanks for the opportunity to testify, and I'm prepared to answer any questions.
Thank you. Director Kearns, were very clear about your policy, DYS, and your confinement. Tell us about your intake process. I was there a couple of months ago, and one of the young men was saying he was confined for 23 hours. And this was probably more in the height of COVID, but nonetheless, it was a juvenile. He was from out of town. He was caught in DC, and he was there. He was talking extensively about him being confined for 23 hours.
Yeah, that's certainly not our practice. So I'd have to, look into the specifics of that young person, but we don't confine young people.
So I talked to, I don't know if you remember, but we talked about this particular incident a while back. So this is not a new thing.
Okay, so I guess I'm speaking generally with regard to this youth. My recollection was when we looked into it that our records and our practice was counter to what the young person was reporting. We don't confine young people to their rooms for that period of time.
So what happens for youth? What's the intake? Can you walk us through what happens in intake?
Well, there are various assessments that are done with a young person before being put on one of, if they're there for overnight until their hearing. It includes COVID testing. So some of the determination about where they go is dependent on the results of their COVID test. But even when they're with us at the beginning of intake, there's not confinement in the way that that I know you reported on that one young person being in room for that long. They're immediately allowed to program, even if they have COVID. We have programming available to them so that they're out of their rooms as much as we can possibly do it within the restrictions of sort of contact with others.
What I'm asking, so I'm asking you to walk us through the process. So that you spoke about it a little bit. So they come in, they take a COVID test. Depending on if they test positive, negative for COVID, they then do what? And they then go where and stay where for how long until they decided that you're going to be on this unit? Can you walk us through that? Because that's helpful for me because I didn't hear that in detail.
Yeah, and I apologize because I might not get all of the very specifics. So, and I do want to make sure that I'm not misstating, the specific sort of moment to moment. But my understanding is that, again, the intake it's a comprehensive process. So the COVID part, the medical screening is one part. There's also a mental health screening. They're meeting with they're called JJICs to understand where they are in the legal process. And then depending on, so typically a young person that's coming to us is what's called an overnight person. So they would come until their court hearing the next day. And so then depending on the outcome of that court hearing, whether they're ordered to stay at YSC or they might be ordered to a shelter house or they may be allowed to return home, that will be the next step in the intake process. So if they're ordered to us, then we would move to the next step. So if they're ordered to remain at YSC, then we would move to our next step of intake, which is figuring out where into which unit they would go. And that depends on, we have units that are for securely detained young people versus committed youth. So young people who are awaiting their trial versus young people who are committed to us and are awaiting placement to a different facility. So that's going to help determine what unit they would go to. And then again, depending on their COVID status would be their initial, where they go initially, because if they have COVID, there's a 10-day isolation period. It depends on the placement is going to depend on their COVID status.
And so with that, first of all, let me ask, how many youth have we had that was deemed in isolation? And second, was deemed in isolation because of a potential suicide risk?
And just to clarify, what do you mean deemed in isolation?
So there are units that are, so you just said that if you have COVID or test positive, you in 10-day isolation. So there are other isolation methods that the facility practice to separate a youth from population for various reasons. And I'm asking essentially what classifies a person to be in isolation?
Okay, so specifically regarding COVID isolation, that's the 10 days.
I'm not speaking about COVID.
So we don't have another type of isolation. That COVID would be the only example of an isolation status. And again, it's not It's not room confined. I mean, it's not a room confinement determination. It's what unit they're on, which determined, and so they're able to do programming when they're on COVID isolation, meaning they're isolated from other members of the community to reduce COVID spread. You mentioned though.
Okay,
sorry.
so I got a question. So when I went to visit one of the units in which the young man was located, he was in a unit in which the cells were along the wall, and in each cell there were a youth in each cell, which is it was all males in this particular cell, were by themselves. He was stating that he was in the whole intake process. He wasn't by himself. It was a whole group of them in that room. Are those individuals in intake allowed to come out, or they have to stay in until they finish a process? And if so, how long is that process? Because those individuals were in a cell by themselves. Well, I've seen at least 2 in a cell by themselves. I'm not sure because of the number, or was it COVID?
Yeah, so to be clear, all of our cells are individual units. We don't have young people staying in a cell with another person. So no matter where anybody is in our program, whether that's at Youth Services Center or at New Beginnings, they're all individual cells. And this is where I don't want to misspeak. So I believe that there's a time that they're on an intake unit, meaning that others we're trying to determine which longer term unit they're going to go on. So, and again, it depends on their status, if they're detained youth versus DYRS youth. But being on intake, it's not impactful in terms of the amount of time that they have outside of their cell. So intake is not a term aligned with confinement, room confinement, isolation, anything. It's just part of the process of moving into a longer term unit on the either YSC or another placement. And all of our units are physically the same. So it's not like our intake unit, they have more young people per cell or anything like that.
So, Director, can you clarify this? Because in your statement, you said that this particular bill is a higher threshold than what's already implemented at the facility, and you stated that the average length of time that a youth spent in solitary confinement was 43 minutes over the last year, which is the longest amount of time the youth was confined during that time. But then you said there's no solitary confinement. Can you give some clarity on what you meant by that? Because that helps me out a lot.
Yeah, and okay, so apologies that I wasn't clear. So I was specifically talking about room confinement. So that's used only when there's imminent danger to a young person, to themselves or to others. So where a young person is put into a room to alleviate the imminent danger. In those situations, a young person, our average amount of time for this year, so through October, has been 43 minutes.
So that's what I'm trying to. I then follow up with a question of if an incident happened or action happened, where's this particular place located in the facility? Is this New Beginnings? Is this YSC? Does it have this particular place at each location? If you, because it was saying I'm not understanding what's going on.
I mean, so you're asking where they are physically. If we take those, we just assume.
Yeah, because you said there's no place that exists there outside of COVID restrictions. So now there is a place, and I'm trying to find out where is the place that relates to in the facility, and is it both facilities?
Okay. When a young person is placed into room confinement, and again, that's only for imminent danger to themselves or to others, they're placed in their own room.
Thank you. That gives me clarity. And what's some of the offenses that you see, since you've been a director, that people have been placed in their room confinement for?
I mean, it would, again, it's imminent. It's like physical altercations that we're the only way to stop it is by removing a young person from the physical altercation with another young person toward a staff. It's that level, because there are a whole bunch of things that have to happen before we would move to, again, it has to be imminent danger, imminent harm. If a young person's like yelling or something, I mean, we have a whole bunch of things that have to happen before we would move toward room confinement. Verbal de-escalation, talking with young people, trying to bring them down before we would even be considering room confinement.
So give me an example. A young person is in a physical altercation and strikes a staff, right? Someone is called, they're rushing there to kind of de-escalate the situation. The young person is identified by other staff members. The other person assaulted has to go somewhere. What then happens with that young person?
I mean, it's going to be a case by case basis. I don't
So
want
this
to
is an
say.
example.
Okay, well, the example, they got into a fight. Again, it depends on when assistance is called in. If the situation has totally calmed down, then we may be moving to a restorative session, like with just a verbal discussion. Or if the altercation is still continuing to happen, then we will be moving to place the young person in the room until they can calm down.
Okay, so they go into the room. He or she is still irate, loud, belligerent, not calming down. So who enters the room? Who is specialized? Who is the person or title that's specialized to go in the room to de-escalate the young person?
So it's a range of staff. So all of our staff, direct staff, so from youth development representatives, supervisory youth development representatives, everybody who works with young people is trained on de-escalation, but we also have a mental health team. So we're required to have mental health interview within an hour. If we're not able to get the young person to be in a place to come out within an hour, they're being assessed by our mental health team. So, but it would typically be the staff that's on the unit or a supervisor or someone else who maybe be brought in who has a good special relationship with that young person to try to, again, the whole goal is to get them out of their rooms. We're not seeking ways to keep young people behind a locked door. We're looking for ways to bring them back out into programming.
Thank you. And this mandatory mental health conversation happens in the room, or is it somewhere else they go to the help suite? Where is that taking place?
In the room.
Okay, so there's how many? I know you have a number of people working in the health suite, but how many are dedicated to mental health services?
I don't want to give the wrong number. I believe we have 5 at each facility, 5 at New Beginnings and 5 at YSC, but I can get you the exact number. I don't have an org chart in front of me.
How are these how are you all documenting children needing or receiving mental health services? How is that process documented and reported?
Yeah, I mean, we've got really strict requirements around documentation. So, I mean, it's case notes, we have to document everything. Mental health records go into one database because it's protected information, but there's very strict requirements around all of our documentation.
Yeah, but what are they, and who is reported to? Does it goes to the therapist? The therapist then gets it to the associate director, to you. Does it get reported to the council, to the mayor? Can you walk us through the process?
So it depends on what information you're talking about. So for instance, I mean, mental health records, so information that is regarding a young person's mental health is protected information, and that would be that's managed by our mental health team and put into a database that is protected based on HIPAA laws. And then we also have our FAM care system, which is our database for collecting, making sure that we're documenting things that are happening with young people, both in the community and in our facilities. And so that's bought through, through the chain of workers within our facilities that will be putting that information into FAM care.
And what about unusual incidents? Being a detention facility for youth, we all know that there are incidences occurring here and there that requires it to escalate. I'm not getting into medical records per se, but we've had incidents where youth have been hurt and alleged that staff has done it and vice versa. How does that process escalate to a supervisor, and how does it go to get up to you for you to evaluate?
So there are again, there are a whole bunch of reasons why something would be deemed an unusual incident and would require very specific documentation. So instead of like a case note, for instance, we were talking about filling out paperwork for an unusual incident, and it has to be signed off on by, so it's typically created by a youth development representative, is the one who would have witnessed what happened. And then it would go to be signed off by the SYDR, supervisory youth development representative. Depending on the severity, it may or may not get to I mean, some of the unusual incidents, that aren't that big. I wouldn't say they're not a big deal at all, but they're not that big of a deal where they're not going to raise up to my level. But based on what type of incident it is, it would lead to video review. We have a team that is our compliance team that's looking at our videos to make sure that what's written in the report actually matches up what we see on the video. So and these happen every single day. So the unusual incidents have to be reported in the moment, and they're uploaded into our system. They're sent to our compliance monitors. This is happening in an ongoing moment-to-moment basis.
Thank you. That's helpful. I want to touch a little bit on suicide watch. Do you know how many youth have been on suicide watch in the last year?
So in the data that I got to prepare for today in this year, so I'm sorry, in FY22, so I guess that was an entire fiscal year, we had 32 examples of where we initiated suicide precautions. It was 23 young people, so that means several of them probably had multiple incidents.
Okay. And what's the process with what happens in those situations?
Again, it depends on the severity. So I think I mentioned in my testimony, there are two different levels that we would be handling internally, called SPS1 or SPS2, SPS1 being more significant potential for self-harm. And again, these are ones that we feel we can handle internally. For ones where we feel that the young person needs acute psychiatric care, that's when we would be looking to an external, looking to Psychiatric Institute of Washington or Children's Hospital for a more thorough assessment, which may require hospitalization.
How many youth do we still have out of town that are detained for special needs that we may not offer in our care in the district?
Let's see. I'm looking at. I didn't think to pull all those numbers for today, so I'm just looking at what I have in front of me from. Looks like in September, from a day in September, we had 9 young people were placed in facilities for psychiatric or behavioral issues.
What is our methods to correspond, because we heard in the testimonies by several individuals today about human interaction, human touch, restorative justice practices, human care, being close to their families. What are some of our practices to keep youth communicating with the agency and also with their families?
And are you talking specifically for young people who are placed out of the area?
Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, we have requirements for our own personnel to visit young people, make sure that the care that they're receiving is appropriate and helpful and the right fit for them. And again, we certainly absolutely do not take having a young person placed out of state lightly. It is not our first resort. It's our last resort, and only for very specific reasons, largely around psychiatric care that they cannot get in DC, or around a specialized intervention that is not available here. Or lastly, if there are very significant fears for their safety. And then each of those programs is going to have different, each of them are going to have different kind of requirements and plans for how to be sure that they're engaged with their families. So we pay for families to be able to go see their sibling or their child when they're placed out of state. We support that financially, but again, it depends on what the rules are for the program.
What can you give me? What facilities are our youth at now? Because I thought the number had went down, but it sounds like 9, as if it went back up again.
And again, I'm looking at September, maybe a month right now. That could be slightly different. We have some youth that are at Keystone Newport News, which is a psychiatric facility in Virginia. We have several youth that are at Abraxas. There are a couple different Abraxas programs that are in Pennsylvania. Again, at this time, we had one youth who was placed in Georgia at a place called Coastal Harbor. We have youth in the Woodbourne Center, which is in Baltimore. So those are some, that's pretty much the list that I'm
Do you
seeing.
still have kids at the Joe Gibbs facility?
We have one youth placed there, Youth for Tomorrow.
Okay. I wanted to know, for the residents that are placed out of DC, would the DC law, like the Comprehensive Youth Justice Amendment Act, apply to those youth at those facilities?
I don't know the answer to that.
Okay, 'cause I think I heard you say we had to check with those facilities about certain policies. What is done to ensure that the threat of imminent danger does not return? If you can walk me through that, that'd be helpful.
So you're talking about, for instance, if a young person who's been physically fighting, and how do we reduce the likelihood for that to happen again for that?
Yeah.
Okay. So, I mean, we do have a restorative justice team, which works with young people on specific conflicts as well as conflict resolution. Generally, we have multiple programs that happen in our facilities related to how to, manage behaviors. So we have lots of different ways of doing it. Of course, and like I've said before, our goal is not to use room confinement at all. We are doing everything we can to avoid that and really working on behaviors. Also, we're careful about our placements of young people, what unit they're on, whether that be at YSC or at New Beginnings, to try to reduce neighborhood conflict as well as address neighborhood conflict. But also, we try not to set young people up for conflict.
I got you on that. And how often does staff receive training about de-escalation and around policies for the standard operating procedure when dealing with conflict?
Yeah, so our orientation process is quite extensive. And so they absolutely learn about all of our policies, including de-escalation, room confinement policy, all of that during their initial orientation, and then their annual training requirements on all of those as well.
And I heard you also say, in speaking, that youth are coming out of their cells. How often are they coming out of their cells, and how often are they staying in the cells? What's the time out of the cell versus the time in the cell? On average, I know it varies on different persons.
Yeah, generally we're trying to have them out of their cells the entire day, with the exception of bedtime. And then transition time, there's a moment where we do a count to make sure that all young people, when we have a shift change happening. And other than that, depending on I would say the exception would be if we have a COVID, like we might have a COVID unit or a unit where there are young people who are on isolation for contact. And they need to be separated from young people who aren't on any kind of quarantine status. And so we have to just balance the movement of those young people to make sure that they're not crossing. So there might be some time in rooms because of that.
Gotcha. And there's also at New Beginnings, an area in which the youth can go outside. I think it has a basketball court out there. Are the youth back out there participating now? I know it was restricted for quite some time during COVID.
Yeah, we try to have our young people outside as much as possible. In fact, we just started a running program. So we have all the youth training for a 5K run. So we're spending a lot of time out in the back on the track area to make sure that we're maximizing all of the open space.
Have we ever had a youth that attempted to actually commit the act of suicide there? If so, how many and how long ago?
New Beginnings, not to my recollection. I can certainly find out, but I don't recall that at New Beginnings.
What about YSC?
YSC, my recollection, and so I've been here since July of last year, so a little over a year. I can think of one suicide attempt. And then others where they're put on suicide watch. Like I said, I listed that, that number where they're showing, they're talking about its possibilities, maybe minor self-harm, things like that.
What is minor self-harm?
So like scratching yourself until you bleed. Again, and talking about wanting to kill oneself.
So the one incident that you do recall, what happened is a protocol in that incident?
So there is a very strict protocol around that, and I could follow up to share the policy on that with you if you'd like. We do an internal debriefing on it, where there's a significant write-up that happens. So there are some protocol pieces in addition to deciding the status of the young person. So whether they're on SPS 1, SPS 2, whether or not they need to be sent out for potential psychiatric care at a psychiatric facility.
So, but this incident, did this person have to get? I'm speaking about a specific incident. Did this person have to get sent out of the facility?
Yes.
Okay. And did this person return back to the facility?
They did.
One of the concerns we also heard continuously on the adult corrections was that the out of time spent out of the facility didn't count for their time spent in the facility. And I know you all are trying to get the youth to level 6. Is that the number?
At New Beginnings, yes.
Okay. How does them being out of the facility affect their time inside the facility?
Honestly, since I've been here, I don't believe we've had any young people from New Beginnings be placed in a psychiatric facility, but we're not looking, this is being at New Beginnings is not a sentence, there's not a set amount of time. So we would hope that for them to get psychiatric treatment, if they really need it, we would be advocating for it because we want them to get the treatment that they need. It would not be a ding against them. But again, ours is not a sentence that they're fulfilling. It's a progression through the program.
Right. And talk about that progression real quick as it relates to the levels. And I think you mentioned New Beginnings, but I'm just speaking in general.
Yeah, so we have a level system that is assessed approximately every 30 days, where young people at the end of the time period, where they're at the end of approximately 30 days, they're basically advocating for themselves about why they would be eligible to move to the next level. And they talk about what they've learned, how their behaviors have changed, and the different programming that we have fits into those different levels as well. And there's a whole team that's working with them and advocating for them and helping them. We want them to move through the levels. We want them to learn new techniques for behaviors. And so there's a progression that happens that is related to behavior change.
And at what level are they deemed eligible to be released?
Level 6 at New Beginnings. They do then what's called a home petition, which is their petitioning to be. So again, the petitioning process is them advocating for themselves along with their team that they're ready to be returned to the community.
So across the board, at minimum, based on what you explained, they'll be there minimum 6 months just to be eligible. Because
yeah, our program is at least 6 months.
And in the course of a young person being there and may mess up on the 4th month, does he or she repeat that 4th month or go back down to, is there any case where they go back down to level 1 or 2 or drop?
No, they don't go back levels. It would just be a slow in their progression forward. And again, we're not expecting perfection. So you mentioned like a mess up. A mess up does not mean that they can't still progress. We're not looking for perfection.
Got you. And what's some of the release conditions, or what happens when a person is at 5 and going to 6 and know that he or she is going to be released, that ensures that they have the best wraparound services and care once re-entering back into the community?
So it's going to depend on the individual needs of that youth, where their plan is or where they're going. If they're going home versus to foster care versus to a group home versus to a different facility. So we're planning for the type of placement as well as what do they need when they're in that placement. And so again, we have a team called the core support team, which is looking at all the pieces. So what they need educationally, what they need in terms of potential mental health services, what they need in terms of credible messenger support. So all of the specifics are really going to vary depending on the use needs.
Thank you. That's it. I guess one of the last questions. There is a requirement within this legislation that's additional reporting. Do you see that being an issue for the agency?
Again, we really vastly exceed what's written in the legislation. And we already report out on, I'm pretty sure we cover all of the reporting that's proposed in here. There's not much. We have a lot of reporting requirements, including talking about how much time young people are spent in room confinement that we already share. So again, the CYJAA is more restrictive than this is. So this legislation wouldn't change our practice in any way.
All right, that's good for me. Thank you, Director. I do want to let the public know that this is one of our round tables. Also, there'll be another round table or discussion on if it hasn't already happened. I'm not sure. I'm not on the Judiciary Committee. And you can, if you haven't submitted any testimony, there are a number of organizations and agencies that need to submit testimony that relates directly to youth services. You can do that by submitting to rya@dccouncil.gov. An official record will be closed on Thursday, November the 3rd, 2022 at 5:30 p.m. I want to thank all the council members that joined on today. Councilmember Che, did you have anything to add? I see you came back on. Okay, maybe not. I want to thank all the council members that jumped back on, that came on to add value to this meaningful conversation to ensure that we are using our power and influence to improve our criminal justice system. With no other business before this committee, this roundtable is adjourned. The time is now 2:00 on the nose. Thank you. Thank you, Director.
Thank you.